In the last video, we learned about basic authentication in the form of username password, sometimes referred to as single-factor authentication. But there are other, more complex and secure authentication mechanisms. Keep in mind the security versus usability trade-off as we work through the different types of multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is a system where users are authenticated by presenting multiple pieces of information or objects. The many factors that comprise a multi-factor authentication system can be categorized into three types: something you know, something you have, and something you are. Ideally, a multi-factor system will incorporate at least two of these factors. Something you know would be something like a password or a PIN for your bank or ATM card. Something you have would be a physical token, like your ATM or bank card. Something you are would be a piece of biometric data, like a fingerprint or iris scan. The premise behind multi-factor authentication is that an attacker would find it much more difficult to steal or clone multiple factors of authentication, assuming different types are used. If multiple passwords are used, security isn't enhanced by that much. This is because passwords, however many, are still susceptible to phishing or keylogging attacks. By using a password in conjunction with a security token is a game changer. Even if the password is compromised by a phishing attack, the attacker would also need to steal or clone the physical token to be able to access the account, and that's much less likely to happen. We won't cover passwords again here, since we talked about them in detail in the last section, but here's the quick rundown. Physical tokens can take a few different forms. Common ones include a USB device with a secret token on it, a standalone device which generates a token, or even a simple key used with a traditional lock. A physical token that's commonly used generates a short-lived token, typically a number, that's entered along with a username and password. This number is commonly called a one-time password, or OTP, since it's short-lived and constantly changing value. An example of this is the RSA Secure ID token. It's a small, battery-powered device with an LCD display that shows a one-time password that's rotated periodically. This is a time-based token, sometimes called a TOTP, and operates by having a secret seed, or randomly generated, value on the token that's registered with the authentication server. This seed value is used in conjunction with the current time to generate a one-time password. Now, as long as the user has possession of their token or can view the display of the token, they're able to log in. I should also call out that the scheme requires the time between the authenticator token and the authentication server to be relatively synchronized. This is usually achieved by using the Network Time Protocol, or NTP. An attacker would need to either steal the physical token or clone the token if they're able to steal the secret seed value. Since a time-based token is synchronized with the server using time, which is not a secret, that would be sufficient for an attacker to clone a token. There are also counter-based tokens, which use a secret seed value along with a secret counter value that's incremented every time a one-time password is generated on the device. The value is then incremented on the server upon successful authentication. This is more secure than the time-based tokens for two reasons. First, the attacker would need to recover the seed value and the counter value. Second, the counter value is also incrementing when it's being used. So, a clone token would only be useful for a short period of time before the counter value changes too much and the clone token becomes unsynchronized from the real token and the server. These token generators can either be physical, dedicated devices, or they can be an app installed on a smartphone that performs the same functionality. Another very common method for handling multi-factor today is the delivery of one-time password tokens using SMS. But this has been subject to some criticism because of the observed attacks through this channel. The problem with relying on SMS to transmit an additional authentication factor is that you're dependent on the security processes of the mobile carrier. SMS isn't encrypted, nor is it private, and it's possible for SMS to be intercepted by a well-funded attacker. Even worse, there have been accounts of SMS-based multi-factor codes being stolen by calling the mobile provider. The attacker impersonates the owner of the line of service to redirect phone calls and SMS to a phone the attacker controls. If the attacker has already compromised the password and can get SMS redirected to them, they now get full access to the account. Of course, there's a convenience trade-off when you use a physical token. You have to carry around another device in order to authenticate. If the device is lost or damaged, the user won't be able to authenticate until the device is replaced. This also requires support overhead, since devices will fail, be lost, run out of batteries, and get out of sync with the server. Using an app on a smartphone addresses some of these issues, but still requires some additional support and inconvenience. When prompted to log in, the user must retrieve a device or phone from their pocket and manually transcribe the numbers into the authentication page. These generated one-time passwords are also susceptible to man-in-the-middle style phishing attacks. A user can be tricked into going to a fake authentication page by sending a phishing email, something along the lines of, "Your account has been compromised, please log in and change your password immediately." When the victim enters their credentials in the fake page, including the one-time password, the attacker has all the information needed to take over the account. The other category of multi-factor authentication is biometrics, which has gained in popularity in recent years, especially in mobile devices. Biometric authentication is the process of using unique physiological characteristics of an individual to identify them. By confirming the biometric signature, the individual is authenticated. A very common use of this in mobile devices is fingerprint scanners to unlock phones. This works by registering your fingerprints first, using an optical sensor that captures images of the unique pattern of your fingerprint. Much like how passwords should never be stored in plain text, biometric data used for authentication should also never be stored directly. This is even more important for handling biometric data. Unlike passwords, biometrics are an inherent part of who someone is, so there are privacy implications to theft or leaks of biometric data. Biometric characteristics can also be super difficult to change in the event that they're compromised, unlike passwords. So instead of storing the fingerprint data directly, the data is run through a hashing algorithm and the resulting unique hash is stored. One advantage of biometric authentication over knowledge or token-based systems is that it's more reliable to identify an individual for authentication, since biometric features aren't usually shareable. For example, you can't give your friend your fingerprint so that they can log in as you. Well, you'd hope not anyway. But as schools start to introduce fingerprint-based attendance recording systems, students are finding ways to trick the system. They're creating fake fingerprints using things like glue, allowing friends to mark each other as present if they're late or if they skip school. This is harder to achieve than sharing a password, but it's sort of ingenious of these kids to think up. They really go the extra mile to skip school these days. Not that I'm condoning this behavior, but you can read more about it just after this video. Other biometric systems use features like iris scans, facial recognition, gait detection, and even voice. Microsoft developed a biometric authentication system for Windows 10 called Windows Hello, which supports fingerprint identification, iris identification, and facial recognition. It uses two cameras, one for color and one for infrared, which allows for depth detection. This way, it's not possible to trick the system using a printout of an authorized user's face. An evolution of physical tokens is the U2F, or Universal Second Factor. It's a standard developed jointly by Google, Yubico, and NXP Semiconductors. The finalized standard for U2F are being hosted by the FIDO Alliance. U2F incorporates a challenge response mechanism, along with public key cryptography, to implement a more secure and more convenient second factor authentication solution. U2F tokens are referred to as security keys and are available from a range of manufacturers. Support for U2F authentication is built into the Chrome browser and the Opera browser, with native Firefox support coming soon. Security keys are essentially small embedded crypto processors that have secure storage of asymmetric keys and additional slots to run embedded code. Let's do a quick rundown on how exactly security keys work and how they're improvement over an OTP solution. The first step is registration, since the security key must be registered with a site or service. At registration time, the security key generates a private-public key pair unique to that site and submits the public key to the site for registration. It also binds the identity of the site with the key pair. The reason for unique key pairs for each site is for privacy reasons. If a site is compromised, this prevents cross-referencing registered public keys and discovering commonalities between sites based on registration data. Once registered with the site, the next time you're prompted to authenticate, you'll be prompted for your username and password as usual. But afterwards, you'll be prompted to tap your security key. When you physically tap the security key, it's a small check for user presence to ensure malware can't authenticate on your behalf without your knowledge. This tap will unlock the private key stored on the security key, which is used to authenticate. The authentication happens as a challenge-response process, which protects against replay attacks. This is because the authentication session can't be used again later by an eavesdropper, because the challenge and resulting response will be different with every authentication session. What happens is the site generates a challenge, essentially some randomized data, and sends this to the client that's attempting to authenticate. The client will then select the private key matching this site and use this key to sign the challenge and send the signed data back. The site can now verify the signature using the public key that was registered earlier. If the signature checks out, the user is authenticated. From a security perspective, this is a much more secure design than OTPs. This is because the authentication flow is protected from phishing attacks given the interactive nature of the process. While U2F doesn't directly protect against man-in-the-middle attacks, the authentication should take place over a secure TLS connection, which would provide protection from this type of attack. Security keys are also resistant to cloning or forgery because they have unique embedded secrets on them and are protected from tampering. From the convenience perspective, this is a much nicer authentication flow compared to OTPs, since the user doesn't have to manually transcribe a string of numbers into the authentication dialog. All they have to do is tap their security key. Nice and easy. As an IT support specialist, you may come across multi-factor authentication setups that you'd be responsible for supporting. You might even be tasked with helping to implement one. So it's important to understand how they provide enhanced account protection along with the options that are available.